Me.
Yes.
Yes. Great. So I'm Marjorie Rosenberg from the IATEFL Membership Committee of IATEFL. On behalf of IATEFL, I would like to welcome all of you to this 9th webinar in our series. Our presenter today is Mike McCarthy. Mike is Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics, University of Nottingham, UK, Adjunct Professor of Applied Linguistics, University of Limerick, Ireland, and Visiting Professor in Applied Linguistics at Newcastle University, UK. He's author, co-author, editor of 50 books, including Touchstone, Viewpoint, The Cambridge Grammar of English, English Grammar Today, Grammar for Business, From Corpus to Classroom, The Routledge Handbook of Corpus Linguistics, and several titles in the English Vocabulary in Use series, and more than 90 academic papers. He is co-director with Ronald Carter of the 5 million word CanCode Spoken English Corpus Project and the 1 million word CanBEC Spoken Business English Corpus. His current research involves the creation and analysis of spoken learner corpora in connection with the English Profile Project, with special reference to the development of spoken fluency. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and has lectured on language and language teaching in 43 countries and has been actively involved in language teaching and applied linguistics for 47 years. This webinar would not be possible without our tech hosts, and I would like to thank Mercedes Viola and Paul Sweeney for their invaluable support today and in setting up the rehearsals and uploading the slides. Now, if you have a question, please write it into the Q&A pod on the screen, which is at the moment below the slides. Don't write your questions into the chat box because they will not be answered there. At the end of the webinar, Mike will endeavor to answer as many questions as possible that are in the Q&A box. We will make the slides from today's webinar available for a week on the IATEFL website, and they will be then moved to the archives for members to view along with the recording, which will go into the archives directly after the webinar. As website updates are done by IATEFL head office, both the slides and recording will not be available until next week. And now, over to Mike.
Well, hello everybody, and I hope you can all hear me clearly and see me. Welcome to this webinar. I'm particularly grateful to those people in East Asia who must be staying up very late to take part in this. So I hope I don't send you to sleep while I'm talking. Now, I've chosen to talk about fluency today, and I'll tell you why, first of all, I chose that topic. There are not many pieces of academic or professional terminology about language and language learning which we share with ordinary people, the man and woman in the street. But the words fluent and fluency and fluently, to speak fluently, are words which are commonly used by ordinary people, people who are not academics, people who are not teachers, just ordinary people. They perceive when someone is speaking a language in a way that they term fluent. So for that reason, I think it's quite important for us to, as it were, attempt to understand exactly what it means when we say that somebody is fluent. Other pieces of terminology that we use are never used by people outside of our profession. You do not hear people in the street saying, "Oh, you should hear Mary's collocations when she speaks Japanese." You would never hear that. But you would hear people saying, "Mary speaks fluent Japanese," or "she is fluent in Japanese." So that's the main reason for tackling this question, to see if we can understand it better. And if we can understand it better, then we are on the way towards being able to help our students to achieve it. So, first of all, let's have a look at a dictionary definition of fluency. Here on the screen is a page from the Oxford English Dictionary, the most famous dictionary of the English language. And if we look up the word fluent, This is the definition we get of speech, style, etc., flowing easily and readily from the tongue or pen. So it's this notion of flowing, and the word fluent comes from the Latin fluire, meaning to flow, like a river, like water. The dictionary also notes that a person can be referred to as being fluent. So if you say, James is fluent in Chinese, it means ready in the use of words, able to express oneself readily and easily in speech or writing. So we've got three key ideas here. The first one is the idea of flowing. The second one is the idea that you must be ready. In other words, to be able to use language immediately. And thirdly, you must be able to do it easily without too much difficulty or strain or stress. So that's what we find in the dictionary. Why it matters? I've mentioned already, I believe it matters because it is a term that's used outside of our own profession, but it matters for a couple of big reasons, including within our own profession, the fact that assessment systems, examinations and so on, especially oral examinations, often include this notion of fluency. So for example, in the Common European Framework of Reference, the B2 learner is described as the learner who can ideally interact with a degree of fluency and spontaneity that makes regular interaction with native speakers quite possible without strain for either party. And here we have another idea coming in, and that is that to be fluent is actually something that affects the other person, the person you're talking to. So it's not just that you should have no stress or strain. The Council of Europe document here specifically mentions that the use of language at B2 level should not create stress or strain for the speaker and the listener. Another good reason for why fluency is important is that outside of a professional and academic life, in society in general, there is this fact that we evaluate people who speak our language as a second or foreign language. We evaluate them as to whether they are fluent or not. So, for example, there's some sociological research which suggests that immigrants, incoming populations, when they apply for jobs or when they are trying to get ahead in the jobs which they have taken, they will be judged partly on whether they sound fluent or not, whether they are perceived as fluent. To put it crudely, if you are perceived as fluent, you will get a better job. If you are perceived as not fluent, you will struggle to impress your employer or your potential employers. So fluency does clearly matter. It's something important both for examinations and assessment within our own profession, but also out there in the real world, in the world of academic life, for students, for example, who are studying in countries abroad, and for society in general, for immigrants and their employment chances and their opportunities to achieve economic success. So just to underline this, I think it's important to note that in the Common European Framework of Reference, obviously the A, B and C level are considered quite different in some ways. I just want to note the fact that the B level is labeled officially as the independent user, and I think this also points to something about fluency, that if you want to call yourself a B1 or B2 learner, or indeed higher, C1 or C2, you have to be able to use language independently. So without too much help from a teacher or from a dictionary or from some other kind of support, you become an independent user of the language. And I think that's also an important factor in how we understand the idea of fluency. Now, if we look at the research that's been done on fluency and books and papers which deal with the subject of fluency, we find certain themes coming back time and time again, recurring themes. And one of those themes is speed of delivery, the speed at which you are able to speak. Of course, the problem here is that speed is relative. That at the moment, I hope you will consider that I'm speaking English fluently, but in fact I'm speaking rather slowly. I'm not speaking very fast at all. And indeed, if we were now having a social conversation over a cup of coffee, I would probably bore you to death if I continued to speak at this speed. Imagine if I said, "Oh, let me tell you about my recent holiday in Tenerife in the Canary Isles. The weather was wonderful." You would very soon, I think, lose the will to live and become very bored. However, in a lecture or webinar like this, it is appropriate for me to speak quite slowly. So speed of delivery is very relative. The problem is that conversation, face-to-face conversation, is actually quite fast. And a normal speed of delivery. Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me, Mike, and excuse
Hello?
me, everyone. This is Paul Sweeney, where some people are having some problems with audio lag. So Mike, what we suggest is we're going to pause your video, which will free up some space for the audio, and hopefully that will. Okay, so now you're paused, and okay, ready to go again.
So I can speak again.
Go ahead now.
Okay, so the speed at which you speak is very relative, but conversation is quite rapid and has to be quite fast, friendly, informal conversation. In fact, it's probably something like about 120 words per minute. It varies a little, of course, but on average, conversation is quite fast. Another criterion for judging whether someone is fluent is the number of times and how long they pause when they're speaking. Now, of course, we have to pause to take breath and to think. But again, in friendly, informal conversation, the pauses are incredibly short. Some research which has been done on many different languages around the world shows that the average pause, the average little bit of time between one speaker and another, is about half a second. So when it is your turn to speak, you've got half a second before you have to start speaking, and if you don't start speaking, you may be judged as having a problem or not being very fluent, or being a bit slow, etc. So again, these things are relative to the kind of speaking that you're engaged in, with conversation being perhaps the most challenging, the most difficult type of speaking of all, in which to display yourself as a fluent speaker. Another criterion is, of course, disfluency. That is, when your message breaks down and is no longer coherent. And of course, this does happen now and again. So the content of what you say needs to flow coherently, to be on topic, and to be meaningful. I think we could all agree on that one. The final criterion that we find in the research is automaticity. And this goes back to our dictionary definition of fluency, the ability to be ready and to speak easily and readily. And to do that, a lot of your language has to be automatic. You can't afford the time to think, how do I say this, or what do I say next? Now, this question of automaticity I'll come back to later. But those are generally the criteria that we find in the literature about fluency. But today I want to add further criteria. I want to add 3 more points, which are partly related to these points, but which I think take us very clearly to the center of the problem. So I would like to add these criteria as ways of judging fluency and also as important aspects of our teaching when we teach speaking skills or when we want to focus on fluency instead of just focusing on accuracy. The first of these criteria is the ability of the learner to use chunks. And chunks are 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 words which occur together, fixed phrases, frozen pieces of language. Can the learner use chunks accurately and automatically? So we have 2 factors here. When you are using fixed phrases, fixed chunks in the language, first of all you have to obviously have the words in the chunk correct and accurate, but above all, chunks must be automatic. And to give you a very simple example, one of the most common chunks in spoken English is, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. It's very, very common. We use it all the time in conversation. It is a way of saying to the person that we're speaking to, you and I are friends, we're on the same wavelength, we understand each other, we have a similar view of the world or of our cultures and so on. You know what I mean. But you have to say it very quickly, and you have to say it in one breath. So if someone says, are you coming out this evening? You might say, no, I feel a bit tired. You know what I mean? That's very fluent. I feel a bit tired. You know what I mean? It is very strange if you said, no, I feel tired. You know what I mean? Sounds very strange indeed, doesn't it? It completely changes the meaning of the chunk. So chunks have to be said quickly and automatically. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. But going on to the next point, I want to have a look in this webinar at how we construct our turn. When it is our turn to speak, how do we create our turn in such a way that it links smoothly to the previous speaker's turn by using some kind of linking language, linking words or phrases, which help to create that feeling of flow, that feeling that the conversation is flowing, that it is not disfluent, it's not disjointed, it's not broken down, that it is flowing like the river. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Thirdly and finally, I want to add this criterion, and that is, can the learner use a repertoire of small interactive words? And these are small words or small phrases such as just, actually, I mean, etc. The reason for adding these words is that there is research which shows that speakers who use these words in their conversations are heard, are perceived by the listener as being more fluent. Now, these are words that are not very noticeable in conversation. We hardly notice them. They're small words, and very often we don't see them in textbooks or in language courses simply because we're not very aware of using them. But as I said, there is research which shows that these little words can actually influence the judgment, the way someone is perceived as being fluent or not being fluent. So I'm going to take these three criteria one by one and have a look at them in turn. So let's start with this first one. Can the learner use chunks accurately and automatically? I'm going to show you here a list of chunks which consist of three-word chunks, taken from the CanCode spoken corpus, which is a corpus that I developed with my colleague Ronald Carter at the University of Nottingham, and which was generously funded by Cambridge University Press. And we collected 5 million words of spoken language. In that corpus, these are in fact it's 21 rather than top 20 because I wanted to make it nice and neat in 2 columns. Here are the 21 most frequent chunks of 3 words in informal, friendly conversation. I don't know, a lot of. I mean, I don't think. Do you think? Do you want one of them? You have to. It was a. You know I. You want to. You know what? Do you know? A bit of. I think it's. But I mean, and it was a couple of. You know. The. What do you at the moment? When you look at this list of chunks, what jumps out at us is how interactive they are. It's all about you and me. And your ability to use these chunks smoothly, quickly, automatically, not only helps you to sound more fluent, it also helps to create that interactive feeling of being engaged in the conversation, of being a full participant in that conversation. These chunks, by the way, are most common in British and Irish English. But if you look at a list of chunks for North American English, for example, you will find more or less exactly the same ones. So the most common chunks are concerned with creating interaction between yourself and your listeners. And they're always spoken very quickly and very automatically. And I think that's something that we forget in language teaching. We're very happy if our students correctly form a question with, do you think? You know, if it's grammatically correct, that's great. However, to sound fluent, you need to say this extremely quickly. Do you think? Do you think? Do you think? That's when you're going to sound most fluent of all. And number 21 there, at the moment. Yes, it's an expression you have to remember to get the preposition correct. It's at the moment, not in the moment. But the whole point about fluency is you need to say it very quickly. At the moment, at the moment, at the moment. Now this sounds like a big challenge for speaking skills, having to speak very quickly. And it requires a lot of practice, a lot of repetition. Whether it is repetition in the class in the old-fashioned sense of drilling, or, and I think this is better, actually repeating them inside your own head constantly when you're sitting on the train, when you're just walking down the street. Hear them in your head, repeat them 100 times until you can say them quickly and accurately. But it is a challenge. But there is also some good news about chunks. And that is that as long as you can say the chunks quickly, the rest of your message can be said somewhat more slowly, and people will still consider you to be fluent. Let's go back to my little conversation that I invented earlier. Are you coming out tonight? No, I'm feeling tired. You know what I mean? Now, the chunk, you know what I mean, has to be said very quickly, but the rest of the message can be said quite slowly and in a relaxed way. No, I'm feeling tired. You know what I mean? So, slow message, fast chunk, you are fluent. But if you do it the other way around, fast message, slow chunk, it's very strange. No, I'm feeling tired. You know what I mean. It just doesn't work. It's just not fluent. So, simply by focusing on the most common chunks and focusing on getting these little fixed expressions quick and fast and automatic, we can transform the perception of fluency in our listeners. But let's move on. Oh, before we move on, there you are. If anyone is thinking, I'm sure all that data is British, I did say earlier that we find very, very similar chunks in North American English. Let's move on to the second of our criteria here, and this is about how you construct your turn when it's your turn to speak, and how you can make your turn link smoothly to the turn of the person who has just stopped speaking. Getting your turn right, that's what it's all about, creating a good turn. You panic, it's your turn to speak. It's a conversation with friends. You've only got half a second. What do? Or somebody asks you a question. You only have half a second. Well, fluency includes the ability to construct a good turn and to link it smoothly to other people's turns, creating what I'm going to call confluence. Now, by confluence, what I mean is that each participant in the conversation has to be fluent for it to be successful and to work properly. But when you put the different voices together, you create something which is bigger than the individual parts. You create confluence, just like when two rivers meet and they flow as one river. Geographers call this confluence, and I think we can talk about the same in language, especially face-to-face dialogue. And what you're trying to do is to create a conversation which is fluent, not just I need to be fluent or he or she needs to be fluent. We need to create flow. We need to create a fluent conversation. How you start your turn is the most important. Remember, we said you've got half a second, then it's your turn to speak. The first words that you use in a successful turn show your reaction to what you've just heard. Now, this may sound obvious, but actually, when you look at, again, at textbooks and dialogues in textbooks, when you look at how learners perform in tasks, in oral examinations and so on, very often this crucial little bit is forgotten. There is research about how we open our turns, particularly done by a very good Chinese linguist, Hongyin Tao, in 2003, who did a big study of how people opened their turns. What were the first word or words that speakers use when it's their turn to speak? And Tao demonstrated quite clearly from his corpus the turn openers, as he called them, the first word when it's your turn to speak, primarily attend to what the previous speaker has just said. And I added this myself in an article which you can access freely online, and I'll give you the reference how you can find this at the end of this webinar, that the purpose of these turn openers is to create this flow in conversation. The turn openers are context sensitive. They may be different in academic contexts or different in business language, for example, than in ordinary conversation. And again, I can give you a reference to an article about that. But the basics about turn openers is that they provide that vital link with what you have just heard. They show your listener, firstly, that you have heard what they said, secondly, that you have understood it, and thirdly, that you can make a connection between what they said and what you have said. So the conversation is coherent, it is interactive and engaged, and it flows like a river. Here on this graph is a list of the most common turn openers in the corpus that I referred to earlier on, which is a corpus of 5 million words of native speaker conversations in English. And this graph shows you the most common words that people use as the first word when they open their mouths to speak, when it's their turn to speak. So we've got yeah, I and oh, no, well, but, you, so, yes, it's, right, then finally the. And we haven't got time to look at all of these, but I want to focus on just two of them. That is, excuse me, well and right. I just want to focus on those for a moment. If we look at typical native speaker conversation, we find these words all over the conversation. This is an example here from our corpus where people are planning a holiday. They are looking at different holidays and how many nights. Is it 13 nights or 14 nights? And one speaker says, see, these are all like 13, 14 nights. And the next speaker says, it doesn't say what they do, does it? So it doesn't say what type of accommodation or whatever. Well, they're self-drive tours, but all right, so they don't know how many nights. Oh yeah, they do. Look. Well, it tells you how. And if you look at this little bit of conversation, notice how the people start their turns. Notice how they use these words like well and oh and right, and little phrases like see, which is, of course, a very quick chunk instead of saying you see. If we take away those words which are highlighted here, the conversation would sound rather strange. It would sound more like two robots speaking, or it might even sound like a police interrogation. It would not sound like a normal, friendly conversation. So these turn openers are really important. Now, using software, we can look at a corpus, sort of hundreds, thousands of examples of these words in conversation, and we can ask the computer to give us a profile of those words. We can ask the computer, where do these words normally occur? I'm going to show you what the results are if we feed into the computer the words well, right, and oh. Okay? Now, along the bottom of the screen, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here mean the first word when you open your mouth to speak, the second word you speak, the third word, the fourth word, etc. So if it's your turn to speak and you say something which consists of, 12 or 15 words, what is the first word you say? What is the second word, etc. And we notice that well, which is in the blue there, prefers to be the first word in your turn. It's far less frequent as the second word or the third word or the fourth word or the fifth word. Oh is even more marked. Oh loves to be the first word when you open your mouth. Right is a little, the red there, right is a little bit less extreme. It's more tolerant of being a little bit later on in your turn. Using this kind of analysis, we can build up profiles of words and how these words are responsible for starting your turn and creating those links and creating fluency. I'll give you another example of a turn opener, because there are, of course, many common turn openers. This one was not on my graph, but it's a very common one. The word basically. Here's a conversation again from our corpus. The speaker says, and I think MX. MX, by the way, just means a male speaker whose name we have taken out to protect their privacy and anonymity. I think MX was counting on being able to output some stuff over the weekend. They're talking about their work here, their jobs. Yeah. Basically, our problem is that when we get the thing opened with the high rate scans, we find that some of the trannies here means transparencies, they are digitizing transparent photographs, just won't take enlargement to that size. So they're talking a technical problem about their job. And the speaker here uses the word basically to say, well, I'm not going to talk for a long time. I'll give you the important point about the problem. In fact, in reality, when people say basically, they usually go on and talk for a very long time. But that's another point. If we ask the computer to show us the profile of the word basically, we see that it most frequently occurs as the second word that we speak. And I'm sure you can guess why this is so. It occurs most frequently as second word because it is kicked out of the first place by more powerful words. Words like well and so and right. In our corpus, we find many examples of people saying, well, basically, so basically. We do not find one example of somebody saying basically well or basically so. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that there is a kind of hierarchy of important words for starting your turn, and some words are more powerful than others. It tells us that your speaking turn has a structure, just like grammar, except this is a structure of conversation. It's not the structure of a sentence or a clause. This is the structure of the turn. And some words are more likely, more able to be word number one than word number two, and vice versa. So we often find people saying, well, actually. People often say to me, you live in Cambridge, because they know I write books for Cambridge. And my answer is usually, well, actually, I live near Cambridge, in a small village outside of the city. Well, actually, well, actually, well, actually. Nobody ever says, actually, well. Everybody always says, well, actually. So we have a kind of a chunk, well, actually, well, basically, so basically. And these are very important, not only because they help you to sound more fluent, but because they create that flow in the conversation, which changes the conversation from being a police interrogation into a friendly exchange. And the listener or listeners will judge you to be more fluent if you can do that. On your screen there, you have an example of a computer concordance for the word basically. And if you look down the center of your screen, you will see these little diamond brackets which indicate that there is a new speaker starting to speak. And you'll see here the word basically. Sometimes it's the first word that we use, but very often it's the second word, and it comes after words like so and well and yeah. Okay, so how you start your turn is clearly important. Let's move on to the final point here. I'm going to jump over a slide here, and I'm going to jump to the third point, which is the issue of the small words, the small interactive words that I mentioned earlier, like actually and basically and just and so. And I want to look at how things change and develop across the levels from CEFR A2 to C1, elementary to advanced level. And I'm going to refer here to data from the Cambridge Learner Corpus, just to finish off my talk, to show you how these features of fluency emerge. Here on your screen is a conversation at A2 level in an oral examination between two young women who are doing a paired task. And the task is that they have to ask each other questions about breakfast. You know, what do you have for your breakfast? Where do you normally eat your breakfast? What time do you eat your breakfast? Etc. And it doesn't matter if you can't read the whole of this conversation in time. You can just see that there's speaker 1 and speaker 2, candidate 1, candidate 2, CO1 means candidate 1, F means female. And they're asking questions. What I would like you to notice is two things. First of all, the way they open their turns is more like, well, it's more like an interrogation rather than a conversation. We don't find many of these turn opener words. We find and some pauses, but we also find straight in, jumping straight in, where do you have breakfast? How many days? How many times? What do you eat? When do you have breakfast? So it's a classic question and answer session. It's not really like a conversation. Now, of course, these are only A2 students. Perhaps no one has taught them or helped them to practice words like well and actually and so and basically. But they're not difficult words, are they? So why not practice some of these words, even at the lower levels? The other thing I want you to notice here, down there towards the bottom, is that there is a pause of 4 seconds. 4S there means 4 seconds of silence. And 4 seconds of silence is a very, very long time. And in conversation, it is our duty to fill the silence. And again, we have small words. The language gives us small words and phrases for filling the silence so that we still manage to sound fluent, even if we are not sure what we want to say. Now, these learners are very low level, and of course they have problems in that way. We can understand them. We can say, yes, they are grammatically accurate. In fact, there are no grammatical mistakes in this conversation, but what it lacks is fluency. It is accurate, but it is not particularly fluent. It doesn't flow. When we get to B2 level, and again, it doesn't matter if we don't read the whole of this conversation, we find something quite different. By the B2 level, we do find these successful learners here using chunks like I think. And the second speaker there says, well, for example, yeah, shopping, yeah. The topic here is shopping. And this Italian boy has very fluently started his turn by saying, well, for example, shopping. He's keeping the conversation going. It's flowing all the time. You will have to take my word for it, though, that the grammar in this conversation is not very good at all. They make many grammatical mistakes. So the two girls in the lower level conversation were grammatically accurate, but not fluent. These two boys are fluent, but not grammatically accurate. So we can see that there is a difference. My time is running out, so I'm going to finish by looking again at finally at this problem of the small words like just, actually, I mean, etc. And I want to look at a B2 level Chinese, female Chinese student in an oral examination. And just to note that she's very good at starting her turns with these words, and during her oral examination, on several occasions, she begins her answer, actually, actually. And again, she comes over as quite fluent. She doesn't just answer, so when the examiner down the bottom says, and who else would you like? She doesn't say, I like Coco Chanel. She says, actually, I like Coco Chanel very much. So she's producing this characteristic turn opener. She's at B2. So as we help our learners up the ladder towards fluency, what can they achieve? Well, you might be interested to know that in the case of the word actually, it starts to emerge as turn initial. Students start to use it at the beginning of their turns in a big way around about B2 level. Before that, we find some examples, but not many. The typical B2 student starts to use actually. By the time we reach C1, 10% of all of the uses of actually are at the first or second word of the learner's turns in the data that we looked at. This compares very well with native speakers. If you look at native speakers, 11% of uses of actually are turned initial in a 1 million word sample of native speaker conversation. So students can achieve a very high level of fluency by a few relatively simple devices. The documents which the Cambridge Examinations Board publishes to give you advice, to give you tips on how to be successful in oral examinations, include little typical good conversations. And time again, we find that the tips that they give you, the top tips for succeeding in oral examinations, is in fact to use these turn openers. So even if they're not conscious of the importance of these turn openers, they consider that a good conversation will have a lot of these. I'm going to finish there because my time has run out. But if you want to read more about this subject, go online to the free English Profile Journal, and you will find the substance of this talk, plus the bibliographical references which I've mentioned. And it's simply http://www.englishprofile.org. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll now take a few questions. There's a technical question first from Lindsay in Uruguay. What do the frequency numbers mean on the 3-word chunks slide? These are the number of occurrences of these chunks in the data set. It's as simple as that, really. And you have to remember that there will be a great difference in frequency between the occurrence of single words and the chunks. The longer the chunks, the lower the frequency. And Mark Andrews wonders why it is that these chunks are not often systematically taught as chunks. Well, I think it's because there are several reasons. One is because we think of them as pieces of grammar. We think of I don't know if as negative of the verb know plus a conditional sentence beginning with if. In some way, we have to get away from that view of grammar, and we have to think of language as composed mostly of chunks, and that grammar is the glue that helps us to glue the chunks together. This was the view of my own great teacher and mentor, the late Professor John Sinclair, who sincerely believed that most of the spoken language consisted of chunks, and that grammatical choices, having to make new choices in the grammar, was something you used to stitch together, to glue together the chunks. So it seems to me, as I said earlier, there is a good reason to help our learners to practice once they have mastered the basic grammar, like I don't know, or I think, or at the moment, that we simply help them to practice saying them very rapidly. You can have fun in the class doing this. I know I try to do it myself when I speak Spanish. How fast can I say these chunks in Spanish? Juan Carlos Rascon from Portugal wonders whether grammar mistakes should be relevant for someone speaking fluently. Well, again, the research suggests that people are more affected by the general flow of things and that they're actually quite tolerant of grammatical errors. What they really don't like is when the conversation just doesn't work because it's too slow, it's too much strain, too much stress. So people are quite tolerant, in fact, of a few grammatical mistakes, not too many, but fluency and accuracy are two different things. Now, a couple of people have asked, should we teach turn taking as such? Well, I don't think we need to teach turn taking because all human beings take turns in conversation. But what we can do is include in our dialogues and include in our speaking practice the little pieces of language, the repertoire which enables you to sound fluent, to make sure that we teach the key phrases with which we open turns, like well actually, or so basically, or well really, or right, or well. All of these little things, which are often forgotten, are terribly, terribly important. Somebody asked a very interesting question here, Sarah. Does L1 affect the fluency of English as L2? And this is something where I think linguists are not very good at giving the answer. That we don't know enough about what makes good speakers in our own language. We tend not to judge, especially if we, like myself, we use corpora. We tend to just look at all of the speakers. But I think in our hearts, we know that some people are better speakers than others. And maybe this is some research that we need to do. We need to find out, why are some people better at conversation than others? Whether I think it's more important to be fluent than accurate, that's a good question. In my own personal language learning, I like to be both. I like to think that I can be accurate, but I know that in terms of perception of the listeners, fluency is more important. Perhaps not for examiners or for teachers, but for people out there in the real world. If you're a student and you go abroad and you want to make friends with local students, being heard as fluent is more important than being heard as accurate. And I think another thing that we can say is that when we practice things in class like listening, comprehension, and so on, and we give our learners listening tasks, that is a good opportunity to get them to not only listen and understand, but listen and respond. And it is in that listening and responding that's where they have the opportunity to show their fluency, where they have the opportunity to practice these items which contribute to fluency. So, any strategies on the best way to use these in class? Well, in the Touchstone course, which I'm one of the co-authors, we include a lot of these things in listening and responding activities. I think that's a very good place to use them. How does fluency vary as we go up the scales? Well, certainly by the time you reach C2 level, I think it's possible to demonstrate that C2 students really are approaching native speaker levels of fluency, and that they have a wide range, a wide repertoire of language chunks, not just those 20 that I showed you, or 21. That will be one of the great qualities, the ability to automatically use chunks. Somebody quite rightly said I haven't mentioned pronunciation, the role of pronunciation, and again, rightly, you will be judged on your pronunciation. But you won't be judged, and there is research to suggest this, you will not be condemned just because you have a foreign accent. The key to pronunciation is to be understood and to be clearly understood. So the target in pronunciation and fluency, the target is to pronounce clearly enough so that your message is understood. But pronunciation faults, foreign accentedness, for example, does not override the general perception of fluency. I am absolutely convinced that the general perception of fluency is connected with the feeling that the conversation itself is flowing. In fact, as I said earlier, I want to throw out the idea of fluency and being fluent, and I would rather start to think about confluence, how you create flow together with the people that you are in conversation with. And I do think that it's not only in teaching and materials that we should start to think more about exactly what it means to be fluent. Yes, indeed, I think that examiners and Cristina Rodriguez, for example, mentions exam raters, that exam raters should have this as part of their awareness of conversation and what it means to flow. Let me have a look at, see if there are any. Somebody says whether CanCode has shown us when people use actually as a turn opener. Yes, that was one of my last slides. I hope that it was clear in both audio and video. Actually is used as a turn opener in the CanCode corpus, about 11% of its occurrences. So, 1 in 10 or 11. 1 in 10 or 9 every time someone uses the word actually, it's at the beginning. So it's a word that loves to be at the beginning. I'm really grateful for the questions you put here today. Unfortunately, time is running out and it's the weekend. I know those of you in East Asia probably waiting to go to bed. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Do follow it up on the http www.englishprofile.org. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll just turn my mic on again. Is it working?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mike. It was really enlightening. I think we all got an enormous amount out of this webinar. And we're very, very grateful to have you present for IATEFL. It's just great. Thank you.
Okay.
Just for the information, can we see the slides for the next webinar? Yes. Our next IATEFL webinar is going to be with Felicity Odell in exactly a month, on Saturday, the 22nd of March, 2014, at 3 p.m. GMT, so 3 p.m. UK time, on onesies and selfies, keeping up to date with new English words and expressions. And regarding the SIG webinars, BSIG has one on Sunday, the 9th of March, at 3 p.m. GMT with Kirsten Wächter, who will be talking about bringing football into the business English classroom. And LTSIG has one on Sunday, the 23rd of March at 2 p.m. GMT with Gary Motterdam. We'll talk about innovation in learning technologies. Please check the IATEFL website for more details, information, and the login details for these upcoming events. And I would like to thank all of you. We had about 120 people at some point, for giving up some time on the weekend, always precious time, but for making an effort and coming along and contributing to this webinar. Thank you, everyone.